Getting a 2/3 creature for only 2 mana is a very good rate. This is especially true when that creature has some additional abilities, as they usually do these days. 2 mana 2/3s used to be really rare, especially when they had upside, but these days we seem to get a few of them in every single set. I've actually looked at 2 mana 2/3s in this series before, back in March of 2022, but we've had so many new 2 mana 2/3s in the last 2.5 years that the list has changed significantly. In all, there are 78 2 mana 2/3s in Magic, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Since I'm actually revisiting this topic, I also want to take a look at the 4 cards that made the list in 2022 but didn't make it this time, starting with General's Enforcer, which was at number 10 last time. It costs a white and a black, and it makes your legendary humans indestructible. It also has an activated ability that costs 2 generic, a white, and a black, and it exiles a card from the graveyard, and you get a 1/1 human token if that card was a creature. The Enforcer gained all of its points in 2020 in standard Winota decks. Obviously enough, those decks were built around a powerful legendary human, and the fact that the Enforcer is a human also meant that you can put it into play using Winota's creature attack trigger. However, it never became a permanent fixture in Winota decks, which did go on to more success in the format. So, it hasn't gained a single point in the last 2.5 years, and that's what led to it falling off of the list. Next, there's Ailey, Eternal Pilgrim, which was at number 9 last time. For a white and a black, she comes with Death Touch and 2 activated abilities. You can pay 1 generic and sacrifice another creature to gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness, or you can pay 1 generic, a white, and a black, and sacrifice another creature to exile a non-land permanent, but you only gain access to that ability if you have at least 10 more life than your starting life total. Obviously, that first ability makes it more likely you'll be able to use the second. She gained all of her points in the Standard of 2016 in Rally the Ancestors decks. These were decks that specialize in reanimating their whole graveyard with Rally. Because the creatures are only around very briefly, they don't get the opportunity to attack, so the deck could be used to Rally by using sacrifice effects to get value out of all those bodies, and Ailey was one of the ways to get value out of them, since she could make your life total absolutely enormous. She hasn't gained any points since 2016 though, and that's why she fell off the list. Next, there's Boros Challenger, which was at number 7 last time. For a red and a white, it comes with Mentor, which means that when it attacks, you can put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. You can also pay 2 generic, a red, and a white to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. If you drop a creature on turn 1, there's a good chance that on turn 3 the Challenger will mentor that creature, and you can even use the buff effect to make it easier to mentor stuff, although that's something you'll usually only do when you don't have anything else to do with your mana. The Challenger's top 8s all came in the Standard of 2018, where it was unsurprisingly played in Boros aggro decks. And the last card to make the 2022 list that didn't make it this time is Thorn Lieutenant, which took quite a tumble from the number 5 spot it held last time. For 1 generic and a green, this elf gives you a 1/1 elf warrior token whenever it becomes a target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, and you can also pay 5 generic and a green to give it +4/+4 until end of turn. Most of this card's value comes from that triggered ability, since it guarantees that your opponent will never come out ahead when they use removal on it. The Lieutenant saw play in a variety of green aggro decks while it was in Standard between 2018 and 2019, but it's been inactive since then, leading to it losing its spot on the list. Alright, now that we've covered the cards that have fallen off the list since 2022, let's move to the list proper, starting with our number 10 card, which is Tainted Adversary, which was at number 8 last time. It comes packing Death Touch, and when it enters, you can pay 2 generic and a black as many times as you want, and the adversary enters with that many +1/+1 counters on it, and you create twice that many 2/2 black zombie creature tokens with Decay. Decay means that they can't block, and when they attack, you sacrifice them at the end of combat. While that obviously makes them substantially weaker than your typical 2/2 zombie token, they do give you lots of value since they can still attack and be sacrificed, among other things. So you have a nice baseline here with a 2 mana 2/3 with Death Touch, and in the late game you can sink all of your mana into the adversary. So if, for example, you pay 2 generic and a black once, you spend 5 mana on a 3/4 with Death Touch and 2 2/2 Decay zombies, that's a pretty nice rate. While in Standard, it saw play mostly in mid-range decks, usually alongside Wedding Announcement, a card that likes it when you go wide, and the adversary can definitely help you get there. However, the adversary hasn't gained any points since 2023, and it's no longer in Standard, so it currently doesn't have a home anywhere. So while it managed to maintain a spot on this list this time around, there's a good chance it won't be here anymore when I revisit it in the future. At number 9, it's Lazov, Wearer of Faces, a newcomer to the list. For a blue and a black, you get a creature with 2 triggered abilities. The first one triggers when Lazov attacks and exiles a card from a graveyard and then investigates. The second ability triggers when you sacrifice a clue, allowing Lazov to become a copy of a creature card exiled with it until the end of the turn. So the first ability exiles creatures and makes clues, and the second ability pays you off for having clues and exiled creatures around. A 2-mana 2/3 with just that first ability would already be pretty good, since it means Lazov can effectively draw you cards, so throwing in the bonus of becoming a copy of exiled creatures is a big deal, especially because you can do it at instant speed. This means the first time Lazov attacks, you can exile something, and make it very difficult for your opponent to block Lazov, depending on what you exiled. Upon being printed, Lazov had a ready-made home in Standard in the form of Esper Legends decks. These decks look to get extra value out of legendary creatures, like by using the Neon Dynasty Channel Lands. Many of the legends in the deck happen to be graveyard-oriented too, most notably Rafine, whose Connive trigger can let you load up the graveyard with stuff for Lazov to copy. While these decks lost a lot of cards with the recent Standard rotation and basically don't exist anymore, it does seem that Lazov has successfully transitioned into Dimir aggro decks, where it's currently being played. It's got a whole lot of time left in Standard, and it has a good shot at continuing to move up the list. At number 8, it's Dust Animus, another newcomer to the list, and like Lazov, a 2-mana 2/3 that was printed just this year. For 1 generic and a white, it comes with flying, and if you control 5 or more untapped lands when it enters, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters and a lifelink counter. It also has Plot for 1 generic and a white, which means you can pay that cost and exile it from your hand, and then cast it as a sorcery on a later turn without paying its mana cost. In other words, you can pay 2 for this in the early game and then wait until late to get a 4/5 flyer with lifelink for only 2 mana. Sure, you have to wait around for it, but that's still a pretty great rate, especially because you can run it out on turn 2 if you really need to. Sometimes if you draw it late, you can just naturally have 5 lands untapped too and get a crazy efficient creature. In Standard, it's been played in Orzhov aggro decks, which often run it out on turn 2, as well as in blue-white control decks, where it's a sideboard card. It's always great to bring in efficient life linkers against aggro decks, which often have a hard time overcoming big bodies that gain you life. It functions as a great win condition against them too. It's also being played in blue-white control sideboards in Pioneer, as well as in the main deck of Spirit aggro. The Animus is in a great spot to gain more points since it's already seeing so much play in Pioneer and Standard. At number 7, it's Tomik Distinguished Advocist, which has fallen 1 spot since 2022. Like Dust Animus, it's a white 2-mana 2/3 with flying, but it costs double white. He also comes with a couple of nice hate effects, as white creatures often do. He makes it so your opponent can't target lands on the battlefield or in the graveyard, and they can't play lands from the graveyard either. An efficient creature who disrupts some strategies usually sees play, and that's certainly true with Tomik, who has been played in 4 different formats. In Standard, he was mostly just played as a nice 2-drop in white weenie decks, but in Pioneer, Legacy, and Vintage, his hate effects have some serious application. In Pioneer, for example, he largely shuts down Lotus Field decks, which look to tap and untap the field several times in a single turn, but you can't target it with twiddle effects if Tomik is in play. In Legacy and Vintage, he shuts down life from the Loam decks. It's also great against Legacy lands, which are filled with land shenanigans, including using cards like Wasteland to destroy lands and then recurring them. And with Tomik in play, your opponent can't do either of those things. He's also played in Vintage aggro decks where it shuts down all sorts of things, including Strip Mine. Tomik's ability to hate on all of those strategies is fairly unique, so it's going to continue to accumulate points in Pioneer and the Eternal formats, and move up this list in the future. At number 6, it's Ludovic Necrogenius, a newcomer to the list. While it existed back in 2022, it didn't start putting up top 8s until October of 2022. For a blue and a black, he mills a card when he enters or attacks, and you can also pay X 2 blue and 2 black to exile X creature cards from your graveyard and transform Ludovic into Olog Ludovic's Hubris. When it transforms, it becomes a copy of a creature card that was exiled with it, except it stays as a 4/4 legendary blue and black zombie, and you put a +1/+1 counter on it for each exiled creature. So, Lazov can quickly load the graveyard and then exile the graveyard for serious value by giving you a huge zombie. Like Lazov, who we saw earlier, Ludovic was right at home in Esper Rafine decks, and largely for the same reasons. It's a graveyard-oriented legendary creature. However, Ludovic has also been played in Slogurk decks in Standard, which were even more focused on abusing Neon Dynasty channel lands. However, Ludovic is one of the cards that is rotated out of those decks, and it's never put up points in any other formats, so it may not put up any more top finishes in the future. At number 5, it's Core Skyfisher, which has dropped one spot since 2022. For one generic and a white, it's a 2/3 with flying, and unlike the cards we've seen so far, it comes with something of a downside, because when it enters, you have to return a permanent you control to your hand. This means that if you just have a couple of lands and the Skyfisher around, casting it can feel pretty bad. However, in all of the decks where it's been successful, its ability is used to gain an advantage more often than not. In Standard, for example, it was played in aggro decks alongside Goblin Bushwhacker and Stoneforge Mystic, both of which could generate significant value for you if you return them to your hand. After finding success in Standard between 2009 and 2011, the Skyfisher went dormant for a long while, but it benefited greatly from Pauper becoming an official format supported by Wizards of the Coast, Pauper being a format where only commons are legal. Since then, it's been fairly heavily played in the format, where its great stats and ability to rebuy ETB abilities is nice. It's been played in decks like White Weenie, Boros Metalcraft, and 4-color Ephemerate. The latter deck is all about reusing into the battlefield abilities, so it's especially great there. It's going to keep gaining points in Pauper going forward. At number 4, it's Winding Constrictor, which has dropped 2 spots since 2022. For a black and a green, you get a creature that loves counters. If one or more counters would be put on an artifact or creature you control, or on you, you get one additional counter. It helped spawn an entire archetype when it was in Standard called Golgari Constrictor, which, as you can imagine, was all about adding counters to things. When combined with cards that put counters on more than one creature, like Verdurous, Gearhulk, or Rishkar, things could get especially silly. More recently, it's teamed up with Hardened Scales and Pioneer to put even more counters on things. However, it hasn't put up a top 8 since the 2022 list came out, and it's likely to continue to slip down the list in the future. At number 3, it's Gifted Aetherborn, which held the same spot in 2022. For 2 black, it's a creature that comes with both Death Touch and Lifelink. Those are both great keywords to have on an above-rate creature. Death Touch means it can trade with absolutely anything, and because it has Lifelink, it's going to gain you life in the process, and that's kind of the fail case. In an ideal world, you can rumble with the Aetherborn and take advantage of its stat line while putting the race out of reach with Lifelink. While it wasn't Standard, it was played largely in mid-range decks, but it was also played alongside Winding Constrictor sometimes, since putting counters on this creature is really potent. However, most of its points have come in Pioneer, where it's been regularly played since the format was created in 2019. It's been nice in Mono Black and Rakdos Aggro, as well as in Mono Black Control. It's likely to keep gaining points in the future, but it's got a long ways to go before it ever catches up to the 2 cards in front of it on this list, like the number 2 card, which is Sylvan Advocate, which got bumped out of the number 1 spot on the list. For 1 generic and a green, it comes with Vigilance, and if you control 6 or more lands, it gives itself and land creatures you control +2/+2. So it's kind of like Dust Animus, where it's an efficient creature early, but in the late game it's crazy efficient with additional upside. It was super heavily played in Standard, where it felt like a standard version of Tarmogoyf. The Advocate would likely have seen play in any Standard format, but it got an extra boost out of the fact that when it was a 4/5, it could survive one of the format's main board sweepers, Languish. There weren't any other 2-drops who could do that. It also didn't hurt that it made your creature lands bigger, because there were plenty of those in the format. The efficiency of the Advocate virtually made it into a staple for green decks, and this was true in Control, mid-range, and aggro builds. Control decks could play it alongside their Languishes without being worried they would lose their 2-drop, and the other decks could play it purely based on efficiency. Just to name a few of the decks it was featured in, there was Collected Company, Green-White Token, Sultai Control, Gruul Ramp, and Golgari Constrictor. The Advocate hasn't gained a single point since rotating out of Standard, and that's what led to it losing its number 1 spot on the list, but it still has a huge lead on everything else on it. And at number 1, it's Dennick Pious Apprentice, a newcomer to the list. While it did exist back in 2022, it didn't put up its first top 8 until September of that year. For a white and a blue, it comes with a lifelink, and it makes it so that cards in graveyards can't be the targets of spells or abilities. It also has Disturb for 2 generic, a white and a blue, and that means when it's in your graveyard, you can pay that cost to cast Dennick Transformed into Dennick Pious Apparition, a 3/2 flyer that gives you a clue whenever 1 or more creatures are put into the graveyard from anywhere. He also gets exiled when he would be put into the graveyard. Like several other cards on the list, Dennick has done some serious work in Esper Rafine decks because, like the others, Dennick is a legendary creature who likes the graveyard. It's kind of interesting that that deck had access to so many good 2-mana 2/3s. Anyway, Dinnick was even better in those decks than the others. This is because it can not only protect your graveyard on the front side, he can be cast from the graveyard after being discarded with Raffine. And Raffine's discard trigger, as well as mill triggers from your other cards like Ludovic, would also give you clues. In addition to always being played in those dominant Esper Raffine decks, it was also played in Azorius Soldiers and Blue-White Control decks in Standard. It recently rotated out of the format, but it's also played in Pioneer Blue-White Control, so it's going to add to its score in the future. This makes it likely that it will hold on to the #1 spot on this list going forward. So, those are the top 10 2-mana 2/3s. Do you want to get your hands on any of these efficient 2-drops? If so, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past videos including many more that look at specific creature stat lines, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.